My name's Ethan Miller, and if you asked anyone who knows me, they'd probably tell you I'm the kind of guy who keeps things moving. At 27, I've learned how to balance the chaos of life without losing my edge. I work in a fast food joint here in Seattle, not glamorous, sure, but it pays the bills and gives me just enough time to focus on what really matters. Basketball. Basketball's been my escape for as long as I can remember. There's something about the rhythm of the game, the pounding of the ball against the pavement, the rush of adrenaline when you nail a perfect shot, that makes everything else fade away. When I'm on the court, it's just me, the hoop, and the drive to win. That's the part of me people see. The guy who's confident, maybe a little too cocky, and always up for a challenge. But there's another side of me, one I've kept locked away for years. It's not something you broadcast when you spend your free time with guys who slap you on the back and trash talk every chance they get. I've gotten good at keeping it under wraps, at letting people see what they want to see. And for a while, that worked. Until that night. It was a Saturday, and a buddy of mine had dragged me to this house party. I wasn't exactly in the mood. Work had been a grind, and my legs were still sore from a pickup game the night before, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. "You need to loosen up, man," he'd said, slapping me on the back. "Have a few drinks, talk to some people, who knows, maybe you'll get lucky." The party was already in full swing by the time we arrived. Music blasted from speakers in the living room, people crowded the kitchen, and the smell of beer and cheap cologne hung in the air. I grabbed a drink and tried to blend in, nodding along to conversations I wasn't really a part of. It was the usual scene, loud, chaotic, and a little too predictable. But then I saw him. He was standing by the window, nursing a bottle of something dark, tall and willowy, with the kind of build that looked like it could snap in a stiff breeze. His long blonde hair fell past his shoulders, framing a face that was sharp and angular, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to catch the light just right. He looked out of place, like he didn't quite belong there, and yet there was something about him that drew me in. For a moment, I just watched him, my drink forgotten in my hand. There was a softness to him, a kind of quiet vulnerability that was completely at odds with the noise and chaos of the party. But it wasn't just that, it was the way he carried himself. The subtle tilt of his head, the way his lips curved into a faint, almost hesitant smile when someone walked past him. It was like he was waiting for something, or someone. I don't know what came over me, but before I knew it, I was walking toward him. "Hey," I said, leaning casually against the wall next to him. "You look like you're having about as much fun as I am." He glanced at me, a small smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "That obvious, huh?" "Pretty much," I said, grinning. "I'm Ethan." "Caleb," he said, holding out a hand. His grip was firm, but not overpowering, his fingers long and slender. "So, Caleb," I said, leaning in slightly, "what brings you here?" "You don't exactly strike me as the party type." He laughed softly, the sound low and melodic. "I could say the same about you." We talked for a while, our conversation flowing easily despite the noise around us. He told me he was 20, a college student studying graphic design, and that he'd been dragged to the party by a friend who'd promptly disappeared. I told him about my job, about basketball, about how I hadn't planned on coming either. But it wasn't just what we said, it was the way we said it, the way we looked at each other. There was an understanding between us, a silent acknowledgement of something unspoken, and then it hit me. He knew, just like I knew. I found myself imagining what it would be like to take him by the hand, to pull him close, to run my fingers through that long golden hair. My mind raced with images, gripping those soft locks, tilting his head back, and, "Ethan?" The sound of my name snapped me back to reality. I turned to see one of my buddies making his way toward us, his voice cutting through the haze of my thoughts. "Been looking for you, man," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "You've got to meet these guys in the kitchen, total ballers." I forced a grin, my heart pounding as I glanced back at Caleb. "I'll catch up with you later," I said, my voice steady despite the heat rising in my chest. He nodded, his eyes lingering on mine for a moment longer than necessary. "Yeah," he said softly, "later." As my friend dragged me away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Caleb and I had only just met, but it felt like the start of something I couldn't ignore, something I didn't want to ignore. Later that night, after the party had spilled into smaller pockets of chaos, groups forming in the living room, couples sneaking away to corners, I found myself wandering. My buddy had disappeared into the kitchen with his baller friends, and I had no intention of joining him. The bass-heavy music thumped in the background as I walked down the hallway, weaving through a few scattered partygoers. That's when I saw Caleb again. He was sitting on the edge of a worn couch in a dimly lit room, the soft glow of a lamp casting shadows across his face. His long blonde hair fell loosely around his shoulders, and his lean frame was hunched forward, his elbows resting on his knees. He looked like he was waiting for something, or someone. "You hiding out, or is this your natural habitat?" I asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. He looked up, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "A little bit of both," he said. "It's quieter in here." I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The noise from the party dulled to a faint hum, leaving just the two of us in the quiet, intimate space. "You don't seem like the party type," I said, sitting on the arm of a chair across from him. "I'm not," he admitted, his blue eyes meeting mine, "but sometimes you gotta show up for your friends, right?" "Yeah," I said, nodding. "I get that." We fell into an easy conversation, the kind that felt natural despite the charged air between us. He told me about his classes, how he'd moved to Seattle for school and was still figuring things out. I told him about basketball, how it was the one thing that kept me grounded when everything else felt like chaos. But as we talked, I couldn't stop watching him. His sharp features softened in the warm light, the way his lips moved when he spoke, the slight curve of his neck as he tilted his head. There was something almost fragile about him, like he carried a quiet vulnerability that made me want to reach out, to pull him close and protect him. And then it happened. "I like talking to you," Caleb said, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "Yeah," I said, leaning forward, my arms resting on my knees. "Yeah?" He looked at me then, his blue eyes piercing through the dim light. "It's different. You're different." The air between us thickened, heavy with something unspoken but undeniable. I could feel my pulse quicken, my chest tightening as the moment stretched on. "You don't have to say it," I said, my voice low, steady. "I know." His lips parted slightly, his breath catching as he stared at me. I couldn't take it anymore. The pull was too strong, too real to ignore. "Come here," I said, standing and holding out a hand. He hesitated for a moment, then stood, his long frame unfolding as he stepped toward me. His hand found mine, his fingers slender and warm against my calloused palm. I pulled him closer, the space between us disappearing as I looked down into his face. "Caleb," I said, my voice a low rumble, "you've been driving me crazy all night." He let out a shaky breath, his lips quirking into a small, nervous smile. "You're not exactly easy to ignore either." I didn't wait. I cupped the back of his head, my fingers tangling in his hair, and kissed him. It was firm but controlled, the kind of kiss that left no room for doubt. He gasped softly against my lips, his body tensing for just a moment before he relaxed, his hands gripping my arms. The contrast between us hit me all at once. His softness, his fragility, the way he fit perfectly against my solid frame. I could feel the sharp edges of his collarbone under my palms, the way his chest rose and fell with every shaky breath. "Ethan," he murmured against my lips, his voice barely audible. "Yeah?" I said, my hands sliding to his waist, gripping him firmly. "This is crazy," he said, his forehead resting against mine. "Yeah," I agreed, a grin tugging at my lips. "But it feels right, doesn't it?" He nodded, his eyes fluttering closed. "It does." We stayed like that for a moment, our breaths mingling, the quiet hum of the party in the distance. But the sound of footsteps outside the door made us pull apart, the tension replaced by a rush of adrenaline. "Someone's coming," he whispered, his eyes wide. I grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the corner of the room, out of sight. The door creaked open, and a couple stepped in, laughing and oblivious to our presence. Caleb pressed close to me, his body warm against mine, his breath hot against my neck. "You like this, don't you?" he murmured, his voice teasing. I grinned, leaning down to whisper in his ear. "You have no idea." The danger, the thrill of almost getting caught, it only made me want him more. And as the couple left, closing the door behind them, I turned back to Caleb, my hands finding his waist once more. "Let's get out of here," he said, his voice steady despite the flush on his cheeks. "Your place or mine?" I asked, my lips brushing against his ear. "Mine," he said, his blue eyes meeting mine with a confidence I hadn't seen before. And just like that, the night was only getting started. The ride to Caleb's place was charged with an energy I couldn't quite put into words. The city lights blurred past the car windows, but all I could focus on was him. He sat in the passenger seat, his long legs stretched out, his blonde hair glowing faintly in the dim light of passing street lamps. Every so often, I'd catch him sneaking a glance at me, a small smile playing on his lips, like he couldn't believe what was happening. Hell, neither could I. When we arrived, he led me up to his apartment, a small, modest space that suited him perfectly. The walls were decorated with posters of bands I didn't recognize, and a stack of books sat haphazardly on the coffee table. It was the kind of place that felt lived in, comfortable, and intimate. "Sorry about the mess," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Didn't think I'd be bringing anyone back tonight." "It's fine," I said, stepping closer. "I'm not here for the decor." He laughed nervously, his hands fidgeting at his sides. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He was nervous, but there was something else there too. Anticipation, excitement. I closed the distance between us in 2 steps, my hands finding his waist and pulling him close. He let out a soft gasp, his body tensing for a moment before relaxing into my touch. His blue eyes met mine, wide and searching, and I couldn't help but grin. "Relax," I said, my voice low and steady. "It's just me." "That's the problem," he murmured, a faint blush creeping up his cheeks. "You make it hard to think straight." "Good," I said, my hand sliding up to cup his jaw, then stopped thinking. I kissed him, slow and deliberate, savoring the way his lips softened against mine. His hands found their way to my chest, his fingers tentative at first, but growing bolder as he pressed against me. I could feel the sharpness of his ribs under my palms, the way his slender frame seemed to mold perfectly against mine. "You're so solid," he murmured when we broke apart, his hands trailing over my arms, my chest. "It's kind of intimidating." "And you're so soft," I said, my hand sliding down to his hips. "It's kind of perfect." He laughed, the sound light and breathless, and I couldn't help but lean in, kissing him again. This time it was more intense, more urgent. My fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer as his hands clutched at my shoulders. The contrast between us was stark. His slim, delicate frame pressed against my broad chest, his softness meeting my strength, and it drove me wild. "Ethan," he murmured against my lips, his voice shaky but firm. "Bedroom?" I didn't need to be told twice. I picked him up effortlessly, his legs wrapping around my waist as I carried him down the short hallway to his room. He let out a soft laugh, his arms looping around my neck as he leaned in to kiss me again. "You're strong?" he said, his voice filled with awe. "You've got no idea," I replied, a grin tugging at my lips. I set him down on the bed, his blonde hair splayed out against the pillows, his blue eyes shining in the dim light. For a moment, I just stood there, taking him in, the sharp angles of his jaw, the curve of his collarbone, the way his chest rose and fell with each breath. "You're amazing," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He flushed, his lips curving into a shy smile. "You don't have to say that." "I don't say things I don't mean," I replied, my voice steady. He hesitated, his fingers brushing lightly against my hand. "Thanks," he said softly, his voice barely audible. The room felt quieter then, the air charged with a tension neither of us wanted to break. Slowly, I moved closer, sitting beside him on the edge of the bed. His posture was relaxed, but there was something in his expression, uncertainty mixed with curiosity, that made the moment feel fragile yet important. "You're overthinking," I said with a small smile, hoping to ease the nervous energy between us. "Maybe," he admitted, glancing down at his hands. "It's just a lot." "That's okay," I said gently. "Take your time, no rush." He looked up at me then, his blue eyes meeting mine, and I saw something there, an openness, a willingness to let down his guard. "Thanks," he said again, his voice steadier now. I nodded, leaning back slightly to give him space, but the moment didn't dissipate. Instead it grew, the silence between us filled with unspoken words. "You know," I began, my tone lighter, "you don't give yourself enough credit." He let out a quiet laugh, the tension in his shoulders easing just a bit. "You keep saying that." "Because it's true," I said firmly. The conversation flowed naturally after that, the initial awkwardness melting away as we talked. He opened up about the things that excited him, the things that scared him, and I listened, taking in every word. There was something so genuine about him, so raw, that it made me want to understand him more. As the evening stretched on, the room seemed to grow smaller, more intimate. His voice softened, his movements less guarded, and I could see the walls he'd built around himself beginning to lower. "You're staring," he said suddenly, his voice quiet but teasing. "Maybe," I replied, my tone light. "Can you blame me?" His cheeks flushed again, but this time he didn't look away. "You're impossible," he muttered, though there was a faint smile tugging at his lips. I laughed, reaching out to gently nudge his arm. I'll take that as a compliment. The quiet between us returned, but this time it felt comfortable. I watched him for a moment longer, noticing the way the soft light of the lamp highlighted the angles of his face, the way his hair fell messily across his forehead. "You're easy to talk to," he said after a pause, his voice thoughtful. "That's the idea," I replied with a grin. "Can't have you keeping everything bottled up." He laughed softly, the sound warm and unguarded, and I felt something shift between us, a connection I couldn't quite put into words but didn't want to let go of. As the conversation drifted back into comfortable silence, I realized just how much this moment mattered. It wasn't about rushing anything or pushing boundaries. It was about being present, about creating a space where he felt safe to be himself. The night continued like that, quiet, meaningful, and filled with the kind of connection that didn't need to be rushed. His body responded instinctively, his legs tangling with mine as he pressed against me. The contrast between us was electric. He was all sharp angles and soft curves, his slim frame fitting perfectly against my broader, stronger build. His hands were small, delicate compared to mine, but the way they gripped my arms, my chest, told me he wasn't as fragile as he looked. "I don't know how you do this to me," he whispered, his voice trembling as he pulled back just enough to catch his breath. "Do what?" I asked, my hand sliding up to cup his face, my thumb brushing against his cheek. "Make me feel like this," he said, his blue eyes locking onto mine. "Like I can't think straight. Like I don't want to think straight." "Then don't," I said, my voice firm. "Don't think, just feel." He nodded, his lips parting as he leaned into me, his hands trailing up to my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair. The kiss that followed was slow, deliberate, every movement filled with intent. His body trembled against mine, but it wasn't fear. It was something deeper, something raw and unfiltered. "You're incredible," I murmured against his lips, my hands roaming his back, pulling him closer. "So are you," he said, his voice barely audible, his breath hot against my skin. I felt a surge of something primal, something that made my grip on him tighten, my kisses grow more urgent. The danger of it all, the fact that we were here, tangled together, with the possibility of someone walking in or finding out, it only heightened the intensity. "Ethan," he said, his voice breathy, as he pulled back just enough to look at me. "Yeah?" I asked, my hands resting on his hips, holding him firmly in place. "I've never felt this way before." "Me neither," I admitted, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "But I don't want it to stop." "Then don't," he said, his hands gripping my arms, his voice trembling but sure. The words were like a match to gasoline. I wrapped my arms around him, pulling him into me. Our bodies pressed so close that I could feel every inch of him. His hair was soft under my fingers, his skin smooth and warm, his body slender but strong in a way that surprised me. I tilted his chin up, forcing him to meet my gaze. "You're mine tonight," I said, my voice firm, leaving no room for doubt. He nodded, his lips curving into a small, almost shy smile. "And you're mine." We lost ourselves in each other after that. Every touch, every kiss, every movement filled with a kind of urgency I'd never felt before. It wasn't just about the physical, it was about the connection, the unspoken understanding between us that this was something neither of us had expected, but both of us needed more than anything. And as I held him close, his head resting against my chest, his breathing slow and steady, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a fleeting connection, this was something real, something worth risking everything for. The room felt different now, like the air itself was alive with something I couldn't explain. Caleb lay beneath me, his blonde hair a wild mess against the pillows, his blue eyes looking up at me with a mix of trust and desire that made my chest tighten. His breath came in shallow gasps, his lips parted, his cheeks flushed in a way that only made him more irresistible. I couldn't take my eyes off him. He was beautiful, not in the obvious magazine cover way, but in the kind of way that makes you stop and forget the world exists. His lean body stretched out before me, all sharp lines and soft curves, his pale skin glowing faintly in the dim light. He looked so delicate, yet there was a quiet strength in him that I couldn't ignore. "Why are you looking at me like that?" he asked, his voice soft but teasing. "Like what?" I said, leaning down so my face was just inches from his. "Like you're trying to memorize me," he said, his lips curving into a small smile. "Maybe I am," I replied, my voice low, my hand sliding up his side, feeling the warmth of his skin under my palm. "Can you blame me?" He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled me down, his hands gripping the back of my neck as he kissed me. It was slow at first, deliberate, as if he wanted to savor every second, but it didn't take long for the intensity to build, for the kiss to deepen, for the room to feel like it was spinning around us. My hands found his waist, gripping him firmly as I pulled him closer. His body fit against mine perfectly, his softness a stark contrast to my strength. I could feel the sharp curve of his hip bones beneath my fingers, the way his chest rose and fell against mine, the slight tremble in his legs as they tangled with mine. "You drive me crazy, you know that?" I murmured against his lips, my voice rough, my hands roaming his body. "Good," he whispered, his fingers trailing down my arms, his touch leaving a trail of fire in its wake. "Because you do the same to me." I kissed him again, harder this time, my hands sliding up to cup his face. His lips were soft and warm, his breath hot against my skin. The sound of his quiet gasps, the way his body moved under mine, it was all-consuming, like a fire I couldn't put out even if I wanted to. "Ethan," he said, pulling back just enough to look at me, his blue eyes wide, filled with something I couldn't quite name, something vulnerable, something real. "I've never felt this way before." "Me neither," I admitted, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "But I don't want it to stop." "Then don't," he said, his hands gripping my arms, his voice trembling but sure. The words were like a match to gasoline. I wrapped my arms around him, pulling him into me. Our bodies pressed so close that I could feel every inch of him. His hair was soft under my fingers, his skin smooth and warm, his body slender but strong in a way that surprised me. I tilted his chin up, forcing him to meet my gaze. "You're mine tonight," I said, my voice firm, leaving no room for doubt. He nodded, his lips curving into a small, almost shy smile. "And you're mine." We lost ourselves in each other after that. Every touch, every kiss, every movement filled with a kind of urgency I'd never felt before. It wasn't just about the physical, it was about the connection, the unspoken understanding between us that this was something neither of us had expected, but both of us needed more than anything. And as I held him close, his head resting against my chest, his breathing slow and steady, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a fleeting connection. This was something real, something worth risking everything for. The room felt different now, like the air itself was alive with something I couldn't explain. Caleb lay beneath me, his blonde hair a wild mess against the pillows, his blue eyes looking up at me with a mix of trust and desire that made my chest tighten. His breath came in shallow gasps, his lips parted, his cheeks flushed in a way that only made him more irresistible. I couldn't take my eyes off him. He was beautiful, not in the obvious magazine cover way, but in the kind of way that makes you stop and forget the world exists. His lean body stretched out before me, all sharp lines and soft curves, his pale skin glowing faintly in the dim light. He looked so delicate, yet there was a quiet strength in him that I couldn't ignore. "Why are you looking at me like that?" he asked, his voice soft but teasing. "Like what?" I said, leaning down so my face was just inches from his. "Like you're trying to memorize me," he said, his lips curving into a small smile. "Maybe I am," I replied, my voice low, my hands sliding up his side, feeling the warmth of his skin under my palm. "Can you blame me?" He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled me down, his hands gripping the back of my neck as he kissed me. It was slow at first, deliberate, as if he wanted to savor every second. But it didn't take long for the intensity to build, for the kiss to deepen, for the room to feel like it was spinning around us. My hands found his waist, gripping him firmly as I pulled him closer. His body fit against mine perfectly, his softness a stark contrast to my strength. I could feel the sharp curve of his hip bones beneath my fingers, the way his chest rose and fell against mine, the slight tremble in his legs as they tangled with mine. "You drive me crazy, you know that?" I murmured against his lips, my voice rough, my hands roaming his body. "Good," he whispered, his fingers trailing down my arms, his touch leaving a trail of fire in its wake, "because you do the same to me." I kissed him again, harder this time, my hands sliding up to cup his face. His lips were soft and warm, his breath hot against my skin. The sound of his quiet gasps, the way his body moved under mine, it was all-consuming, like a fire I couldn't put out even if I wanted to. "Ethan," he said, pulling back just enough to look at me, his blue eyes wide, filled with something I couldn't quite name, something vulnerable, something real. "I've never felt this way before." "Me neither," I admitted, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me, "but I don't want it to stop." "Then don't." he said, his hands gripping my arms, his voice trembling but sure. The words were like a match to gasoline. I wrapped my arms around him, pulling him into me, our bodies pressed so close that I could feel every inch of him. His hair was soft under my fingers, his skin smooth and warm, his body slender but strong in a way that surprised me. I tilted his chin up, forcing him to meet my gaze. "You're mine tonight," I said, my voice firm, leaving no room for doubt. He nodded, his lips curving into a small, almost shy smile. "And you're mine." We lost ourselves in each other after that. Every touch, every kiss, every movement filled with a kind of urgency I'd never felt before. It wasn't just about the physical, it was about the connection, the unspoken understanding between us that this was something neither of us had expected, but both of us needed more than anything. The night stretched on, the world outside fading into nothing as we explored every part of each other. He was so different from me, slim, delicate, his body all sharp angles and soft curves, but it only made me want him more. The way he trembled under my touch, the way he clung to me, the way he looked at me like I was the only person who'd ever truly seen him, it was intoxicating. And yet there was a softness to it all too. The way he smiled against my lips, the way his hands traced the lines of my chest, the way he whispered my name like it was something sacred. By the time the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the blinds, we were lying tangled together, his head resting on my chest, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my arm. The room was quiet now, the only sound the soft rhythm of his breathing. "You okay?" I asked, my voice soft as I ran my fingers through his hair. "More than okay," he said, his lips curving into a small, content smile. "You?" I nodded, my chest tightening as I looked down at him. "Yeah, more than okay." For a moment, we just lay there, the silence between us comfortable, the weight of the night still lingering in the air. "I don't want this to end," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "It doesn't have to," I said, my hand resting on his back. "We'll figure it out." He looked up at me then, his blue eyes filled with something I could only describe as hope. "Promise?" "Promise," I said, my voice firm, my grip on him tightening. Even now, as I write this, I can still feel the warmth of his body against mine, the way his lips felt against my skin, the way he looked at me like I was the only thing that mattered. We're still seeing each other, still stealing moments in secret, still risking everything to be together. And every time we meet, every time we're alone, it feels like the first time all over again. The fire between us hasn't dimmed, it's only grown stronger. And I know one thing for sure. I'd risk it all for him, over and over again. Because some things are worth the danger, some things are worth everything.